Hello and welcome to this week's, well, not really this week's, I don't do it weekly, I keep messing that up, this video installment of Melendy Avenue Review. And last time we were here, we discussed one of the two genders, thriller fiction, and we are now going to discuss the other gender, romance fiction. And why that's, the reason why that's a joke at all is because it's, it occurred to me that there were two genres. I'm interested in the history of genre fiction, also just enjoying genre fiction, but it occurred to me I really knew nothing about two of the biggest genres. I knew very little about thrillers, and I'd only read a few, and I didn't think of them as thrillers, really. And then there was romance fiction, which I'd read none of. I had read a little bit about, but I thought, all right, it's kind of, there is a certain respect in my mind, it's almost the sun to the other genres, planets and moons, because it's so big, right? It's so huge, romance. There's so much of it. It's so popular, but people take it for granted and they don't really talk about it that much. You don't get, I know there is a critical sphere of people who talk about romance, but it doesn't really penetrate the outside that much from what I can tell. And so last time we had thriller writer Jack Mahoney, and this time I'm very pleased to have Jillian Daniels, who is a Boston area reader and writer of fiction and poetry, whose work has appeared in Strange Horizons, Apex Magazine, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, various other outlets, also reviews theater for the New England Theater Geek blog. You can find her work at jilliandaniels.com, and I'll put that link in the show description. So Jillian, what's romance? What's romance fiction? What is it even?
It's probably one of the biggest genres out there. As you were saying, there are a lot of readers of it. Specifically in the age of ebook and ebook readers, romance readers were very early adapters of this. Romance Writers of America, RWA, sort of defines romance as a central love story with an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. Okay. And that's like broad strokes, I think, what romance is. We're obviously talking about the contemporary definition of romance, as opposed to Sir Walter Scott's sort of idea of capital R romance, where marvelous incidents happen and knights are fighting dragons or going through a castle and there are beautiful women that turn out to be demons. That's not quite what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I guess that's important to point out, because that is a pretty important genre distinction. So you have, so for instance, I was taught that romance was one of the basic genres of literary fiction, along with like tragedy, comedy, satire, but the idea of romance, what I remember the definition was as being, in that classical sense, of a romance being a tale of reconciliation, like all the adventures in like Daring Do that has to happen before some sort of epic reconciliation occurs, before the hero saves the kingdom, basically. I remember having to remember the genres because I read this work of historiography called Meta History by Hayden White, which is a very interesting book. And he argued that a lot of 19th century historical work was written along lines, these classical genre lines. And to try to remember it and also help my fellow students remember it, I was in grad school, I made a chart of the various characteristics, and I tried to compare them to then contemporary TV shows. And so for romance, I put down Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I haven't watched all of, but it struck me as though, it was pretty close to what Hayden White at least had in mind. And for tragedy, I think I put down The Sopranos, and for comedy, The Office, because in the Shakespearean sense of comedy, right, everybody gets married. And then for satire, I said Arrested Development. But sorry, I shouldn't have just done all that.
No, that's perfect. What you were saying about romance being disparate elements, sort of finding a way to join together. That is kind of what modern romance is about. It's just that modern romance, as we currently define it, tends to zero in on one couple, and they're trying to figure out their relationship.
Yeah.
What I mentioned earlier about the RWA sort of defining it as a romance ends optimistically, one of the reasons I think romance is consumed to the level it is by readers is you know the ending. So anything can happen to the characters on the way to that ending, because you know things are going to turn out okay. During lockdown, I started getting, like, read some romance before, but I got really into romance and really into horror for two very different, well, actually the same reason, honestly. When I'm reading, I really love sci-fi, but sometimes when I'm reading sci-fi or fantasy, I'll get really stressed out and like, what's going to happen to the characters? So I'll take the book and I'll flip to the end and I'll read the last page. It's the worst thing ever. It's a bad habit. I don't do that with horror, and I don't do that with romance. With horror, I know that the characters are in for a bad time. Whether or not it ends tragically, that's part of the journey. With romance, I know people ultimately, things are going to more or less turn out okay. And again, the surprise and the twists are in the journey there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of reminds me of Superman in that way.
Yes.
It's like, we all know Superman's, I mean, most comic book characters are going to win out. But like Superman, I mean, it's almost impossible he doesn't. So like you literally have to just go to great lengths to, I mean, I'm not a big comic book guy, so it could be that there's a lot of examples that go against this. But it seems like you have to go to very great lengths. Like Batman has to invent all kinds of stuff and do all kinds of shenanigans if he's going to beat Superman. But, you know, something's going to happen. There's going to be some way that he's tripped up, but he'll just barely be able to eke it out somehow. So what do you know about sort of the history? What can you tell us about sort of the history of the romance genre? How did it get to be from Sir Walter Scott to the definition that we've got today?
Well, there were a lot of pit stops on the way, at least with the literature I'm familiar with, which tends to be more the Western canon. And I mean, we know based on a lot of information that, say, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho was considered a capital R romance, and it's a very Gothic story with a lot of twists and turns, and it had a very passionate fan base. It did not specifically involve, well, there is a couple that gets together and is kept apart and gets together again, and there's a lot of twisting things. And it doesn't quite match up with modern romance, but I feel like the template was there. As you move into the early 19th century, you get Jane Austen writing Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, and a 4 or 5 novels, depending on how you assemble the juvenilia, essentially, that all prominently involve a woman trying to marry a man or trying to find a man to help secure her future. And these are romantic comedies. They have different shapes to them than contemporary romance, but because of certain critics who fell in love with them at certain points in time and brought them more into canon, they are kind of, romance fans, I feel, often get into romance because there's a sense of respectability to them. If Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre are considered literature, then obviously this book, which is about 2 characters falling in love in, perhaps, if we're talking historical romance, an era that kind of looks like the Regency era or a little later on in the 19th century, it feels less, I think, intimidating to people. I mean, I definitely got into romance because somebody was like, well, you don't read romance, you should try Georgette Heyer. And I was a young writer at this point. And Kelly Link, one of my favorite science fiction writers who does not write romance, she writes like very more experimental science fiction and fantasy, was like, you should read widely. And she wasn't telling this to me personally, to be clear. This was like a big advice article. She's like, if you don't like romance, you should try Cotillion by Georgette Heyer. A few years later, I give it a try and I fell in love. And I went through and started reading more Georgette Heyer, such as Arabella, which is, I think, the book I recommended you read.
Yes, I read Arabella. It wasn't bad. I wouldn't say I fell in love with it, but you know, it was definitely entertaining. So do you want to give the summary of Arabella, or should I?
Sure. I have a very short summary for it. Country
Go
bumpkin
right
girl romances a saturnine wealthy gentleman. They end up happily ever after.
Yeah, yeah. But first, it's kind of twisty because the idea is that okay, so she's a country bumpkin, but she's like educated and stuff. You know, she has various signs of middle class virtue. Her dad was a prelate or like some sort of Church of England guy, and you know, she was respectable. She was still a gentle lady. She wasn't expected to work with her hands or anything. And she's on her way to London to get presented to society, such as it is, such as she was capable of being presented with her relatively narrow economic straits, and she meets up with said saturnine gentleman who's like the dandy king of London, basically. But it's funny. One of the funny things that to me in this book, I'm not trying to like slam it, but Please. it was funny how. All right, so he's kind of a dandy. He's a height of fashion. He has a French nickname, the non-pareil, which means like the unparalleled. But there's nothing fruity about him. And some of the other dandies are depicted as distinctly fruity.
Or
like a
more
little bit
flamboyant.
Exactly. Yeah. This guy, he's you know, he might be in the height of fashion, but he's still a dude.
He's a man's man.
Yeah, he's still a dude. He's ironic. He's kind of over it with romance. And Arabella, the lead character lady, stops at his hunting house, his hunting chalet, or whatever you call it, because her wagon's all busted up, and carriage, I guess. I mean, I guess you don't really have much of a story without it, but it did strike me as a little bit arbitrary that she just like completely out of her character just lied. It was like, I'm the richest lady in Yorkshire. And
he doesn't buy it.
Right, yeah. You only find that out later though, right? Yeah. Or you find it out immediately? Okay. Well,
he's sort of a little later on, he's like, actually, this is a lie.
Yeah.
But he doesn't call her out on it. He just goes along with it.
Right. So she's in London, and this dude, the non-pareil, is like taking her out and stuff. And like she becomes kind of the toast of the town. A lot of people are trying to get married to her, but she's super paranoid that she's upset because she thinks that like the lie will come out of her not having told the truth about, you know, being wealthy, and is worried. She actually starts to like the guy, but you know, can't.
She's living a lie.
She's living a lie, and he'll find out, and she'll be shamed, and it'll be awful. But then her brother comes down, and this is kind of where I lost the plot a little bit. The brother comes down. He gets in trouble because he's, you know, he wants to be like a badass and like do all the fun nobleman stuff, gambling and having nice clothes and whatnot. So he gets in trouble. He gets in debt, and you know, eventually it becomes a thing where like they do get together, in the end. And also she makes him raise a dog. They find a dog that's getting abused by children, because that's what you did in 1817 for amusement, was abuse the local dogs. But they save the dog. You know, she loves dogs, she loves children in many respects, you know.
And the gentleman is like, grudgingly likes the dog, and then the dog starts following him around. And he's like, I guess I have a dog now. Yeah,
you could totally see it working as a movie. I mean, they probably made it into a movie, right? At times, no, maybe.
So I haven't sought out any of the Hare movies because I like the novels so much more. But there are some Hare adaptions. Now, because this book was not written contemporary to when it's set, it was published in 1949, sort of post-World War II novel.
Yeah.
It's, I feel like a place like the BBC would sort of go for the 90th Jane Austen adaptation. Right. As opposed to another Georgette Hare.
Right, it's an established brand, Jane Austen.
Yes, and Georgette Hare kind of, Jane Austen was a brand. Georgette Hare kind of made Jane Austen or Jane Austen tropes into Jane Austen romance fiction.
Yeah.
Jane Austen invented Jane Austen. Georgette Hare invented Jane Austen fiction.
Yeah, there's
And
not quite the same archness or
no.
like underhanded kind of critique of the system. I mean, sort of,
Mhm.
because, well, anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. Arabella is very similar to a story that has a very similar name, Cinderella.
Yeah, yeah.
It is a more of a self-insert
Mhm,
fantasy,
mhm.
which I don't think makes it bad,
Right.
but it's like the fantasy of I will be a good person and I will be rewarded for my kindness and thoughtfulness with social mobility. I will win the game of capitalism by not being an active or monstrous participant in
Mm,
capitalism.
yeah, but
And
you won't be a perfect person, right?
no,
They're still flawed enough that a reader can kind of project on.
the reader can sort of see or project themselves into this person. They're like, well, I'm not perfect either, but maybe I'll end up with a nice guy who
Mm,
I make better with my own presence. And there's that
right.
sort of disparate elements that find like a new, what's the word, sort of like,
Equilibrium.
yes, equilibrium, exactly. It is modern romance is about two characters who have to work through a lot of interpersonal issues to find that equilibrium. And whether that background is Regency London or more of a thriller spy versus spy type thing, I don't know. Romance tends to focus on the love match idea of it.
Yeah, as far as spies go, I actually went to high school with a guy who his mother
Yeah.
is a successful romance novelist who's primarily known. She got famous for she was the one who figured out to make Navy SEALs the male lead. Right, she has this whole series of
Yeah.
Navy SEAL romances, and
Mhm.
she actually has, for a civilian writer, unprecedented access to the SEALs at this point. They love her. Um,
Yeah.
which is pretty amusing. I don't know. For all I know, Jason could be watching this. Hi, Jason. Um, but yeah. So let's.
Mhm.
So Georgette Heyer, Heyer.
I always say hair.
Okay,
I don't
we'll stick
know.
with Heyer. Georgette
Sure.
Heyer. So she was an English writer. She was writing primarily in the like early to mid 20th century. Is that accurate?
She came out with her first novel in 1921.
Okay.
For the first part of her career, she alternated between historical romances and mystery novels.
Hmm.
Sometime in the mid 1930s, she was writing more Regency romances, and by the end of her career, it was mostly romance because that's what the readers wanted.
Yeah.
I've tried her more mystery-oriented books, and I'm just not. They don't click with me quite in the
Yeah.
same way. Yeah, she was really well known for her level of research.
Hmm.
A lot of Regency romance will sort of go into costumes
Mm-hmm.
and the appropriate carriage, like a hackney versus a stagecoach.
Mm-hmm.
And God forbid you, an author, confuse the two. I don't know the difference because I, as a reader, do not care. I'm not
Yeah.
reading for that. But there are a lot of romance readers who are very into that level of detail because that's part of the fantasy.
Yeah.
Um, Hare had like a library of like fashion catalogs from the early 19th century.
Yeah.
She is very well known for for filling out the world in such a way. Joe Walton, who's a big fantasy writer, talks a lot about the world building in Georgette Hare. I think she did a column for Tor.com rereading Georgette Hare, which Tor.com specializes in fantasy and science fiction. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that world building is like so key to Hare's work.
Yeah, that is interesting. Joe Walt, was she the one who did
Among others.
Okay, no, she's not the one I'm thinking of then. Yeah, I'll have to look into it. But yeah,
Thief and Claw. She's done a bunch of books.
okay. I was thinking the time travel one where they go back to bollocks. There's
Oh,
a
do you mean
plague.
the Philosopher King series?
Probably not.
Darn it. Okay.
Sorry.
She did do a time travel one where
Yeah.
a bunch of people try to recreate Plato's sort of utopia.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, gotta look into that. Okay, that's cool.
Yes.
So so Georgette Heyer in the Regency. So I did notice just the depth of like description of things like, especially clothing, right? Clothing, modes of transportation, interior decor to a certain extent. And that was interesting. A little, obviously I'm a guy, and if you can see what I was wearing, like I'm pretty sure literally every garment I have on came in a bag from Target. Because just, whatever, various reasons. I'm sure it's pretty cool though. And if a little, and you have to figure 1949, I think it might have still even been rationing in Britain at that time. Like,
that's definitely one of the reasons that I think she had such post-World War II success. She's writing, especially with her romances, she's writing about a world that at this point is about 150 years ago. So nobody in living memory can confirm or deny or tell the more unpleasant truths about the era, about people dying of incurable diseases and poverty and child labor. She's making most of her, I think almost all of her romances are set in England, so there's a very idealized version. And also, like you said, if you have a world where for the last few years you've been expected to ration and not wear nice clothes, reading a book where everyone wears nice clothes, or most people do, and if it's not, it's like plot relevant. It's important. And
go ahead.
Okay, so I think along with the inclusion of historical detail for the popularity of Regency romance, it's also the things she sort of, or I guess other historical romance writers sort of not exactly elide or leave out, but they don't focus in on. Like almost all of Georgette Heyer's romantic male love interests are wealthy men in the early 19th century. Pop quiz, where was a lot of wealth going to English lords during the 16th and 19th century? Where was that coming from? Answer, African slave trade and other rather unseemly things.
India, Ireland,
it's we are seeing a very specific slice of a world that didn't quite exist, and that's part of the fantasy. And I do think it is important to have fiction that explores genocide and much more uncomfortable truths about history. Romance is a space where that's not going to be the most important thing in the room. I think as important as it is to talk about historical conflicts, it's also important to have a space to take a breather from that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm not, I wouldn't condemn anybody for engaging a certain amount of escapism. I guess sort of why it is, I guess this is sort of a two-parter. So historical romance is a big part of the romance like galaxy, right? Now I'm mixing my astronomical metaphors.
Please, but I'm a big sci-fi person too. I'm a fan.
So historical romance is a pretty big part of it. When I was talking to people I knew who read romance, mostly moms of friends, they all were. Some of them did bring up Georgette Heyer. Others, all of them brought up Regency romances and historical romance more generally. So I guess the first part would be, why is it that historical romances in particular are as popular, and kind of what role do they play for readers? And also, out of all the periods of history, why it is the Regency in particular?
I think it's a lot of to answer your second question first, I think a lot of it is the pioneering work of Georgette Heyer. I also think more modern historical romance writers, Julia Quinn, Tessa Dare, have built out immense followings. And a lot of romance readers and writers look at that and they're like, I want to continue to dive into this fantasy world. And in many ways, I think it is fantasy, and that's the big appeal. Like I was saying earlier, Jane Austen is an accepted part of literary canon. So a lot of, I think, hesitant romance readers, and I was one for a long time, are sort of like, well, you know what? This kind of looks like Jane Austen. I'm going to give it a try. And you're right, it's not as biting with the social commentary. Jane Austen, contemporary to her work, was pinged by a lot of people who were like, why are you mentioning the amounts that the love interests in your novels make? That's not appropriate. Why are you saying that women care about money when they want to get married? And it's like, well, they do, because otherwise you have poverty and you can't own property.
Right, yeah. Yeah. So with the Regency, just a quick for viewers who aren't like aware of what it is, because we've been throwing it around a lot. There's various definitions for it. I'm not like an expert in this period of history. Some people are really strict and say it only counts, it's only real Regency fiction if it comes from the period between when King George III, who Americans know as, you know, the bad guy in the American Revolution, was ruled unfit to rule, which would have been around 1811, till when his son formally became, who was Prince Regent and was in charge, formally became king in 1820. I only just found this out. But other people will say, okay, it goes longer than that, or it goes back further than that. But roughly the period, including the Napoleonic Wars, after the American Revolution typically, but definitely hitting a stop in like the 1830s when you have like the Reform Acts, among other things, the Reform Acts, which semi-democratize Britain, and also pretty soon thereafter you have the reign of Queen Victoria, which is considered a separate period. I guess, and that brings me up to, okay, so there's the influence of Heather Hare. Heather Hare, oh Jesus, man, that's somebody different. Oh fuck me. All right, I don't know if I can delete that, but we'll find out. Georgette Heyer. And in terms of popularizing Regency fiction, I wonder if there's like a meaning to why it's beyond that, why it's the Regency as opposed to the Victorian period. Because the Victorian period is also a period of intense nostalgia for a lot of people. So I'm wondering if that's something you could shed some light on, if you have any theories.
So the Regency era is known for being a little looser with social, not quite social convention, but the costumes were a little bit less colorful, like up to the throat. Often you had very low necklines and stuff. Sex was okay to talk about, not in mixed company. So you have a bit more leeway with sort of the social niceties. I think heading into the Victorian era, it's a lot bit more rigid. And the Victorian era also casts a long shadow into the 20th century. It's very heavily associated with child labor, with chimney sweeps dying, with industrialization of Britain. And meanwhile, Regency romance sort of has a more pastoral vibe. It's more pure. Specifically, Jane Austen wrote about like small towns in the country where people would go into London for the London season and then come back home, like going to an amusement park. I think there's also an appeal with the idea that there is conflict happening in the world, but it's elsewhere. Napoleon is doing the Napoleonic Wars are doing a lot of terrible things in the main part of Europe, but we're not seeing that part. We're seeing the people who are keeping the home fires burning. And what they're doing in their free time is the idea. Like I said, there's a lot of fantasy happening here as well.
Go ahead.
I also think you mentioned yourself that the majority of romance readers are female. I think with the Regency era, there's a way of talking about sexism and patriarchy at a remove. It gets sort of convoluted and difficult to talk about, like, oh, I was passed over for a raise and this guy, Jim, in the department wasn't. He got a raise and also a promotion. I'm a woman. Why didn't I? But my boss is like, no, it's not like that. And it's a little harder to pin down those feelings about social convention and niceties. You go back in time to the Regency era, and women doing fairly things that we consider fairly socially conventional today, being a single mother, wanting to marry for love, dancing when she hasn't been formally introduced to somebody. Like, those are bravely breaking social conventions. And I think there's a satisfying sense of, like, you read a Regency romance and you see a woman who is a little out of step with everything else, but things still go well for her. You're like, oh, this is cathartic and satisfying.
Yeah, it's like they're breaking convention, but in a way that reaffirms later conventions. So what I was thinking with Arabella is like, okay, Arabella expresses interest in the welfare of stray dogs and poor children, right? Like there's a chimney sweep who like falls into her house, and like she's like, I'm going to take care of this child now, or I'm going to make somebody else take care of this child, as the case may be. And of course, it's the guy, and the guy has to take care of him or send him off to the country where you get reports of his mischief. And, everyone around her is like, what the hell are you, what's wrong with you? Like, her relatives and whatever are all like, why are you caring about this urchin? Like, that's not, whereas, Georgia Hare would have known this, not too long in the future from 1817, caring about indigent children became pretty popular with like Victorian upper class ladies. They wouldn't do it on this individual basis. Like they wouldn't sweep in and take care of a child. They would just make sure that they were sent to appropriate homes, which often turned out to be workhouses or the like. And the same with, that's Victorian period is also when you had, I believe that's when like the, various, like the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals would have come about around then. And so, right, this idea that a woman, right, it kind of comes with like the separate sphere ideology, right? The men's sphere is out in the public, like doing battle for business, or with like the rebellious subjects, but like the woman's sphere is in the home and like the domestic sphere. And that includes caring for like people, women, for animals and what have you, and children. But that's, go ahead.
Oh, well, in a post-World War II world, caring for this random child and a dog, that's like, oh, you're the best person ever. Whereas contemporary to the Regency era, that's sort of like, oh, that's kind of eccentric and weird. It's just a dog. It's just a child that you don't know.
Right, yeah.
And so there's this satisfaction, I think, in a lot of romance where you are both bucking the trend, but also upholding a sense of the status quo, at least for your own era.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that can be very cathartic for people, regardless of your political leanings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not too dissimilar with thrillers where like, okay, like the dude, it's usually a dude, like protagonist man, like, he's a renegade. He's on his own. He's running around fucking doing shit you're not supposed to do generally in life, breaking into buildings and killing people. But, he has a code. And his code is a lot like what, desk-bound men would like to think of as their code if they were, involved in whatever kind of shady shenanigans, right?
Yeah. And I think that's very similar. It's a very similar kind of escapist fantasy. If I were in this situation, I would act in a way that was very consistent with all of my beliefs. That is both, and I will be both brave, but also I will manage to make it all work out in the end. I think they're very similar ideas. I think there's a reason romance and thrillers are the biggest genres. The fact romance is also like, sometimes a lot of romance novels are fairly short and can be like, I read a romance novel yesterday in a day. And that's fairly average. I think I'm considered a slow romance reader because I will read like maybe if I have a lot to work to do and I plug in like an audiobook, or if I have a pile of books, I'll get through a couple romances in a week. No, so, some people will plow through like 3 or 4 in a couple days. Um, they're made to there are many subgenres of romance that are made to be very consumable. And I think Regency romance often falls into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what that makes me think of is sort of another question is sort of the experience of reading them and like the social experience of reading romances. Because one of the better books I've read on sort of really one of the better literary criticism books I've read is called Reading the Romance by Janice Radway. Yeah, it's worth looking into. It's from the 80s, so it's a little bit dated now. But what she talked about a variety of aspects of romance literature. And one of them was the subcultural aspect, where you had these communities of readers often grouped around small town used bookstores. I actually remember there was one not too unlike it in Foxborough, Mass. I think it's been long since out of business, but it was like a used bookstore that pretty much only sold romance novels because that was the only stuff that people, mine had like romance novels and like Goosebumps. And I remember I would get like gift cards to it as a child, and I'd have to get Goosebumps because there was nothing else. I didn't particularly like those actually, but I was a snooty kid. But and how the workers at these and owners of these stores would act almost like librarians. They would talk to all the people who came in, mostly women, naturally, mostly women. But and they would say, okay, you'd like this one, but you wouldn't like that one. This one is too explicit. That one over there is more your speed, that kind of thing. And it would be like a community space. So I'm wondering, and so Radway was writing in the 80s. And now, of course, we have the internet.
Yes,
so I'm wondering what romance reading subcultures are like now.
So there are probably still small bookstores out there that have a big number of fans, and with the booksellers acting as curators. But what I see a lot online are romance review blogs, and there are tagging systems that emerge for different reviews that tag hyper-specific things in romance that a number of readers, such as myself, read for. So, oh, you would like this romance book because it has a duke who happens to be undercover, and the heroine doesn't know, but she'll find out. Here's one where the two main characters hate each other, and the story is about them falling in love. That's enemies to lovers. Or here's two characters who were friends and they realize they love each other. Friends to lovers. Here's an open door romance, which means it has sex. Here's a closed door romance, which means it's clean romance. And you get like, I used to think it was just the age of the internet that made these tropes hyper specific, but like there are older romances that seem to sort of fall into these things. Like, here's a book where there is a Highlander, that's the love interest. Here's a book about an arranged marriage, sort of that stuff. And as a reader, you're like, well, I know I liked this when it was in this other book. I'm going to seek out this iteration and see how I feel about it.
So is there a lot of like back and forth about these categories and what counts as part of the categories, or whether new categories are valid or not? Or
yes, and like it's not like a rigid system. There's definitely sort of like, oh, well, this is kind of enemies to lovers if you squint, but not really. I see a lot of back and forth on Twitter. Twitter has romance reader Twitter is big, as far as I can tell. And along with a lot of these book review blogs, there are these communities that spring up that are like people just recommending things to each other and being like, well, if you like this, you love this. And that is definitely part of it. You find this community that is into the very specific thing you like. And
well,
then
no,
that's it.
It makes a lot of sense actually when you think about it, considering how many of these books are published.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, the rest of the publishing world is big enough. Like, I go through catalogs to find stuff to review for some of my reviewing gigs, new releases. And especially with fiction, it's super hard. Like, unless I happen to know an author's name, to be like, especially literary fiction, where like it's all fucking the same boring shit. But sorry.
I feel kind of similar. I don't want to read another story about a couple that's fighting and they're not talking about what the problem is, and it's literature.
Right. Yeah. You know what I mean. But
I do. Yeah.
And it's fucking impossible. You know, I wind up reviewing a lot more nonfiction because I at least know what the subject matter is from what it says. I know whether I'll relate to it or whether I'll have an opinion about it or whether it'll be relevant to anybody.
And you know, literatures can be hit or mainstream literature, mimetic fiction is kind of hit or miss sometimes.
Absolutely.
You don't know what you're getting into. And sometimes I want that. Other times, no, I want that nice, predictable trajectory.
Right. Yeah. So, and especially like if you have, you know, it's a needle haystack problem in certain respects. Like, in theory, any romance novel you get, you know, you're going to get, you know, a romance and an optimistic ending, but you don't know if it's going to have tropes that you like or dislike until, I guess, these critics come around and sort of help guide you through the minefield, so to speak. So that's interesting. I didn't know about that. So the sort of, you know, I actually have been to some used bookstores, particularly in more like rural areas or smaller cities, where they do have big romance sections along with other stuff, and also big men's adventure. Like, so for instance, I think that, you know, Jack and I talked about men's adventure as being the precursor of thrillers. Thrillers are a little glossier, less weird. But I think the generation that bought a lot of men's adventure fiction is getting older and going to retirement homes and what have you, and their kids are selling off. And you also see big lots of romance fiction, big lots of like paperback, sci-fi paperbacks of places. So that's fun. But I've not really delved into men's adventure, I'm afraid.
And I think of more stories like the James Bond novels when I hear men's adventure, or the Doc Savage, like really old school pulp stuff.
So Doc Savage is definitely men's adventure. James Bond is kind of in many respects, according to Jack at least, a pivotal transitional figure, right, from men's adventure to thrillers. But but what I was curious about is, so we've talked almost exclusively about historical romances, and I did actually try to read Outlander, but it was just very long.
It is long.
It wasn't terrible. It was just long, and I didn't have time to finish it before this video.
No, it's a doorstopper.
I read the Wikipedia articles of it and many of its sequels. So that's kind of a sci-fi historical romance because that's a time travel one. And I thought, what are there? I mean, I know there's a lot of different kinds of genres of romance beyond the historical. Are there any that are of particular critical interest today from where you stand?
Contemporary romance is, I think, one of the biggest ones. And contemporary, it usually means like it could happen today, but it often just means sometime after World War II.
Right.
So technically, if you have a romance set in the 80s, that's still contemporary romance, even though the 80s, about 30 years ago. Oh God, I'm old. But yeah, contemporary romance is huge. It's often about a young woman like trying to find her place in the world, and she meets a guy who in some ways will help her make a decision about that. My favorites are Helen Fong's The Kiss Quotient, which is about a young woman who's very successful in her career as a data analyst, but she's on the autistic spectrum. It's one of the few romances, at least up until recently, that addresses autism and neurotypical stuff. And she's like, I have no idea how to have a relationship with a man. I'm going to hire this gigolo a to see how this will work, and I won't fall in love with him. She falls in love with him, and he falls in love with her, and he has reasons for doing what he's doing. And yeah, it's
Interesting.
yeah.
So I guess what I would ask
Yes.
with contemporary romance,
Sure.
I talked to my sisters a little bit about this episode, and they aren't really readers of romance. They are readers of what they refer to, not my phrase, as chick lit.
Yes.
So what is the distinguishing factor between a contemporary romance that hasn't got any supernatural elements or whatever to it? Because I know that's huge too, and we haven't really got time to get into.
The paranormal romance had an enormous boom in the mid 2000s, and we like Charlaine Harris and Yes, go ahead.
So how do you distinguish between a contemporary romance versus a chick lit?
That's a really good question. So chick lit sort of it casually is sort of used to describe fiction mostly enjoyed by women, but women's fiction is sort of a specific thing that a lot of romance readers see as separate from romance. Women's fiction will often still have that romance, but it's also about a woman who's building a career, raising a child, finding support with family, making new friends. One of the biggest examples that is Where the Heart Is by Billy Letts, which came out in 1998 and was adapted to a 2000 film starring Natalie Portman. The beginning is literally about a pregnant woman who gets abandoned by her boyfriend at a Walmart. And then she lives in the Walmart. And and there is a romance. She has that's very important to the plot, but it isn't like central to it as much as it is her sort of building a life in Oklahoma now that this terrible thing has happened, and what she does afterward. So it's just a matter of focus. And honestly, the lines are very blurry sometimes. You do get people who are very persnickety about, well, this doesn't quite count as romance. This is more women's fiction. But it's sort of like, as long as it's a good story is for me like the thing. But you get into marketing and people wanting to see, oh, if I like this book, or a reader likes this book, what else can I sell them? If they like Kiss Quotient, will they like Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert? If they like queer romance, like the Will Darling Adventures by KJ Charles, or Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall, will they like Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston? Like, you end up sort of separating things out into very hyper-specific categories when fiction, we know, is kind of a bit more nebulous.
I do get people occasionally getting me books based on, they think, like, because it has something to do with something I'm interested in or have talked about before. Like, some people will think any book that has to do with like war is something I'll enjoy, which really isn't the case. So you do have this almost kind of Netflixization. I'm sure somewhere somebody is pitching to a VC like, we'll be the Netflix for romance fiction. Work those fucking category systems that they're arranging. The chick lit thing brought me back to one of the sort of Wikipedia rabbit holes I fell into was when I was in high school. I went to a very strange school, and we had a lot of free time, and there were many, many bookshelves just all around, and they were built out of just like random donations and shit. And one book that we had was a book called Scruples by one Judith Krantz. So apparently she was a big deal in like the 70s and 80s. And the reason we knew about Scruples is because somebody flipped through it one day and found some very explicit sexual content. And we would haze new people at our school by reading some of it aloud to them, which, probably not. It's one of the less offensive things I think we did back then, but probably not what I would do now. But
it's teenagers figuring out how to socialize with each other.
Right? Yeah, it's tough. And if anybody walked away, we wouldn't follow them with reading aloud from this book. So somewhat exculpatory.
You're also like 16.
And we're kids.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I
so
remember
apparently,
doing go
yeah.
ahead.
But I was just want to really quickly say, apparently, when I looked it
Yes.
up, apparently it was part of a sub genre of romance fiction at the time called sex and shopping novels. Apparently, the main character, we didn't really read the plot, but apparently
Yeah.
the main lady in the book engaging in these activities was like a girl who married a rich guy so she could start a boutique in Beverly Hills. And it was about all the stuff that she could sell to rich people and all the stuff she could buy with her profits and all of the
Yeah.
sex she had with various people along the way. So
Yeah.
did that turn into chicklet basically? Because that's a little bit between. There was no guarantee that this would end optimistically. It wasn't really romantic. She didn't seem to love anybody, but she did, you know, but
Yeah.
she did. It was also sort of about like her starting a career and like climbing the social totem pole.
I mean, I think there's definitely like a strands that you can connect it with chick lit and sort of its development. Did this book come out in the 70s
Yeah.
or okay? Okay, I think so. In the 70s, the sexual revolution was a thing that white people finally figured out existed, whereas Black and brown people in America had been like, yes, sex is a thing that we talk about sometimes in mixed company. It happens. So you get a lot of films, really big films that have more explicit sexual content, like The Green Door or Deep Throat. And that happened in books too. There was a book that was actually kind of a response to this called Naked King the Stranger, that was actually a bunch of authors who alternated chapters for it. And they were sort of like, yes, we're making like it was marketed as a hard hitting like literature about a woman who doing all these things. This came out in like 1969, so sort of kind of at the beginning of this. And it was kind of a prank that was like by these people who were just appalled at how poorly written bestsellers were. So they're like, we're just going to write a book with like alternating chapters that barely have anything to do with each other that have tons of sex. And they were kind of right. The public was tired of kind of the post World War II respectability where everything was shaken up by the last World War. So we're all going to be as dry as possible. And I think you can see that reflected in sort of the way romance novels and women's fiction evolved, but it's in response to a very big cultural force, I think, not like one thing. Anyway, that's what I think happens.
Yeah, my understanding from Janice Radway, and you would know more about the contemporary scene, is that the amount of sex in given romance novels varies wildly.
Yes.
Like the amount and like the explicit. So like you talked about the open door, closed door. So both apparently have their readerships.
Oh yeah.
And like it's not like this steady upward trajectory of everybody just getting sexier and sexier all the time.
Yeah, and I think there's this idea that that's what happened in American cinema, but I mean, honestly, if you look through rated R films that have come out in the past couple of years, counting the number of times there's explicit sex or women with bare breasts is actually fairly low compared to the 80s and the 70s. So these things I think come in cycles as opposed to sort of like the universe curves toward blah, blah, blah. I don't know. It goes in and out. But yes, you are very correct. There are closed door romances. There is a thing that I don't read a lot about, or I don't read a lot of, called queen romances. And that figures heavily into a subgenre I have not really touched, being that I am Jewish and also more agnostic. It is called Christian romance. And it is like very specifically, here is a romance. It is where there is a sense of lust and two souls meeting, but there's going to be no sex on the page. If it's off page, you have the fade, or if it's in the story, it's a fade to black scenario. And there are people who want to read that either because of their upbringing, what they're comfortable with, or just because, I don't know. So going more into feminist theory, one of the things that emerged from the 70s was the idea of the male gaze in films, where which is which is actually more of the recognition that men are are considered the default audience. So you see a woman descending a staircase in a Hitchcock film, and the camera sort of follows her up, and you will become a part of that gaze. That is male gaze, and it's sort of become associated with nudity and sex in film, but it's actually about sort of a worldview where women are supposed to be lust objects and the keepers of sexuality. And when you're a woman going through the world, there is a sense of, Margaret Atwood put it really well, where you're a woman, but there's also this idea of a man inside of you who's looking at you, at the woman that you are. And I think wanting to read a story without sex, without this idea of a woman as automatically a sexual presence, like that can be freeing for people. I don't find it freeing. I find it more of a return to Puritan ideas, but I'm not saying romance readers who are into it are automatically Puritans. We all go to fiction for different things.
Sure.
That's my 2 cents. And again, I've not read a lot of Christian romance, really any Christian romance. So not an expert in this area.
Yeah, nor me. So I know you have time constraints. So is there anything you'd like to sort of end on, like any either A, like final thoughts on romance, or B, like stuff you want to pitch, like stuff you're doing?
I would say for readers out there, like romance definitely has a very specific reputation in culture for people who haven't read it. Give it a try yourself. I know that because of sort of the gendered way society is set up, a lot of cis men specifically are like, oh, I don't want that, but maybe you do. It's okay. You can give it a try. There is no judgment. And if it's not your thing, that's okay too. For stuff I'm working on, so I tend to write more weird and horror fiction stories. I have a short piece coming up in September in Nightmare Magazine. And I just had a short story published in a zine called Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. It's more of an experimental science fiction. In July, I have a very short piece called House of Wolves that's also more horror based in the magazine Kaleidotrope. So yeah, I've got a lot of stuff out there, and the horror tends to be what is selling.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
One day maybe I'll start writing romance. Who knows?
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, right on. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll make sure to link to your website so people can keep updated on all the stuff you're writing and getting out there. And thank you very much.
Thank you for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I'll see all the Melendy Avenue review folks later on.